that's going to get themselves together. We're not for the whole lot of people sitting around in the big drug den, sitting around complaining.
There is a moment in every great tragedy when the truth finally surfaces, not in a courtroom, not in a headline, but in the quiet of a darkened room, between two men who have carried a secret too heavy for one of them to hold any longer. That moment, according to one witness, happened in London in 1973. A man named Michael Jeffrey, once the most powerful figure in Jimi Hendrix's life, sat across from a former associate, a glass of bourbon in his trembling hand, and said the words that would ripple through rock and roll history for decades. He said he had killed Jimi Hendrix. He said he had to. What follows is the story of how one of the most gifted musicians who ever lived came to be managed by a man who may have seen him not as a human being, but as an investment, and what allegedly happened when that investment threatened to walk out the door. To understand what was taken from the world, you first have to understand what Jimi Hendrix was. Not the legend, not the poster on the wall, the actual man, and what he could do with 6 strings and an amplifier. Hendrix was born on November 27, 1942 in Seattle, Washington, into a home fractured by poverty, instability, and the kind of childhood pain that either breaks a person or forges them into something extraordinary. His parents divorced when he was still a young boy. His mother, Lucille, struggled with alcoholism and died when Jimmy was just 15 years old. Several of his siblings were placed in foster care or given up entirely, because the family simply could not survive intact. Jimmy stayed, but the household he grew up in was one of absence and neglect, with occasional cruelty woven through the silence. He found music the way desperate people find religion, not because it was offered to him, but because he needed it to survive. His first instrument was not even a guitar. It was a broomstick with a single string stretched across it, discarded by another child and rescued by Jimmy, who held it upside down because he was left-handed and there was no one to tell him otherwise. He taught himself to play by watching Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley on television, studying the way their fingers moved and trying to reproduce what he heard coming out of the screen. By the time he was a teenager, he had convinced his father to spend $5 on a second-hand acoustic guitar, and later his father bought him a white Supro Ozark Electric, the kind of instrument that in the right hands becomes a doorway into another world. In Hendrix's hands, it became exactly that. He could not read a note of music. He had never taken a lesson. None of it mattered, because what he was doing had never been done before. After a brief stint in the U.S. Army, where his commanding officers noted in official records that his mind apparently could not function while performing duties, because he was always thinking about his guitar, he returned to civilian life and spent several years grinding through the American R&B circuit as a backing musician. He played behind Little Richard. He played behind the Isley Brothers. He was underpaid, overlooked, and often dismissed. But those who watched him closely could tell that something was happening on stage that had no name yet. The break came in 1966, when a woman named Linda Keith, who was dating Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards at the time, saw Hendrix performing at the Café Wah in New York City and was stunned by what she witnessed. She introduced him to Chaz Chandler, the bassist for the Animals, who was leaving the group and looking to move into artist management. Chandler heard Hendrix play and immediately understood that he was standing in the presence of something that came along perhaps once in a generation. He brought Jimmy to London, helped him record Hey Joe, assembled a trio around him, and the Jimi Hendrix Experience was born. But Chandler needed money and connections to make it work. And so he went to his old manager, a man named Michael Jeffrey. Michael Jeffrey was born in South London in 1933 and made his early name as a nightclub owner in Newcastle upon Tyne. He ran venues that attracted young talent, including a club called the Ago-Ago, which became one of the most celebrated music spots in the north of England. From there, he moved into artist management, signing the Animals and negotiating their record deal. On paper, it sounded like a success story. In practice, members of the Animals would later describe Jeffrey in terms that were far less flattering. They blamed him for working the group relentlessly and appropriating most of their earnings. When the Animals broke up in 1966, there was reportedly only a few £100 left in their band account despite years of hits, tours, and considerable commercial success. The money had not been lost. It had simply gone somewhere that was not where it was supposed to go. Eric Burden of the Animals has alleged that Jeffrey burned down one of his own clubs for the insurance money. Whether that specific allegation is true or not, it points toward a pattern of behavior that would become impossible to ignore once Jeffrey attached himself to Jimi Hendrix. When Chaz Chandler approached Jeffrey for financial partnership, Jeffrey leveraged the fact that Chandler was still under contract to him and demanded a co-management arrangement. Chandler had no real choice. Jeffrey would handle the business and the finances. Chandler would handle the creative side. The arrangement was never truly equal, and everyone involved knew it. Jeffrey claimed 40% of Hendrix's earnings from the outset. Band members, including bassist Noel Redding, were left with fractions of what the music generated. Redding would later recall walking into a room where Jeffrey was filling briefcases with the band's cash. When Redding asked where the money was going, he was told to leave. The question received no answer. The money disappeared. Biographers who studied the financial records from Hendrix's career have alleged that Jeffrey systematically siphoned Hendrix's income into offshore bank accounts, moving money in ways that made it nearly impossible to trace. The contracts Jeffrey held over Hendrix were constructed with such one-sided terms that legal scholars have noted them as extraordinary even by the standards of the 1960s music industry. Jeffrey controlled the copyrights. He controlled the publishing. He controlled the future earnings. The songs that Jimi Hendrix had written in bursts of creative genius, Purple Haze, Voodoo Child, Little Wing, were not really Hendrix's. They belonged, legally, to the man managing him. This is a crucial point, because it explains everything that came next. By 1968, the cracks in the Hendrix organization were becoming impossible to ignore. Chas Chandler, the man who had discovered Hendrix and served as his creative anchor, quit as both producer and co-manager. He was exhausted from the constant battles with Jeffrey over money and control, and he could no longer function in an environment built on manipulation and mistrust. Jeffrey bought out Chandler's share, tightening his grip on every aspect of Hendrix's career. Noel Redding left the experience that same year. He was dissatisfied with the financial arrangements and felt, correctly, that he was being exploited. The band that had defined the psychedelic rock era was disintegrating from the inside. Hendrix formed a new group, the Band of Gypsies, with bassist Billy Cox and drummer Buddy Miles. The music they made together was raw and groove-driven, a departure from what Hendrix had done before. Jeffrey reportedly disliked the direction and is alleged by Miles to have taken active steps to undermine the group's most important performance, at Madison Square Garden in early 1970, by interfering with Hendrix's state of mind before he took the stage. The Band of Gypsies dissolved not long after. Through all of this, Hendrix was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. The relentless touring schedule, the studio demands, the legal disputes over contracts, and the growing awareness that his manager might be stealing from him had worn him down to something fragile. In the months before his death, he was reportedly suffering from a persistent flu-like illness, chronic sleep deprivation, and a deepening disillusionment with the music industry that had made him famous. He had also, critically, begun to speak about leaving Jeffrey. This was not an idle complaint shared with friends over drinks. Hendrix was actively exploring his options. His management contract with Jeffrey was due to expire in December of 1970, just months away. If Hendrix walked away at that point, he would be free, or as free as anyone could be under the terms Jeffrey had constructed. He would lose access to his back catalog, which Jeffrey controlled, but he would be able to build something new on his own terms. Jeffrey allegedly knew this. And according to those who have studied the financial arrangements of that era, the prospect of losing Hendrix was not just a professional setback for Jeffrey. It was potentially catastrophic. Jeffrey had debts. He was being sued over money owed to former clients, including members of the Animals. He had constructed his entire financial house on the income generated by Hendrix, and without Hendrix, the house would collapse. Then there is the matter of the insurance policy. In 2009, a former roadie and Jeffrey associate named James "Tappy" Wright published a memoir titled Rock Roadie. In it, Wright claimed that Jeffrey had taken out a life insurance policy on Jimi Hendrix valued at approximately $2 million, with Jeffrey himself named as the sole beneficiary. The implications of such a policy are not subtle. If Hendrix died by accident or under circumstances that could be described as natural or self-inflicted, Jeffrey would collect the payout. If Hendrix fired Jeffrey, Jeffrey would collect nothing. The financial geometry of the situation pointed in a very specific direction. Some have disputed the existence of the policy, noting that documentation is difficult to verify and that Jeffrey died before he could be questioned directly. But the allegation is consistent with what is known about Jeffrey's character and his history of treating artists as financial instruments rather than human beings. The night of September 17, 1970, Jimi Hendrix spent time at a friend's apartment in London. His girlfriend at the time, a German figure skater named Monika Danman, was with him. The evening ended badly, with an argument that spilled out into the street. Danman was reportedly jealous of Hendrix's interactions with other women at the gathering. They argued for some time before separating. What happened next is where the official account and the allegations diverge so sharply that they cannot both be true. According to Danman's account, Hendrix took 9 of her prescribed sleeping tablets in the early morning hours of September 18th. That was 18 times the recommended dosage. She claimed he fell asleep, and she herself dozed off. When she woke and found him in distress, she called an ambulance. The call came at approximately 11:27 in the morning. Hendrix was taken to St. Mary Abbott's Hospital in Kensington, where doctors worked on him for over an hour before he was pronounced dead at 12:45 that afternoon. The official postmortem determined that he died of asphyxia due to aspiration of vomit, contributed to by barbiturate intoxication. The coroner returned an open verdict, a legal finding that means the evidence was insufficient to determine whether the death was accidental, intentional, or something else entirely. The gaps in Danman's account have troubled investigators and journalists for decades. The ambulance was not called for many hours after Hendrix allegedly lost consciousness. There is no record of who actually placed the call. Hendrix was found lying on his back in the flat with the door open and the gas fire running. Ambulance workers who arrived at the scene gave accounts that conflicted with Danman's description of events in several important respects. Most significantly, the surgeon who treated Hendrix at the hospital, a doctor named John Bannister, came forward years later with a recollection that clashed directly with the official autopsy findings. Bannister stated that he observed a significant amount of fluid in Hendrix's airways and lungs, and that the fluid was red wine, not vomit. He also noted that Hendrix's blood alcohol level was relatively low, which was inconsistent with the amount of wine that appeared to be present in his system externally. This distinction matters enormously. If a person drinks wine, it goes into the stomach. For wine to appear in the lungs in significant quantity, it would have to have been forced in from the outside, with the person either unconscious or unable to resist. Bannister's account suggested that someone had poured liquid directly into Hendrix's airway while he was already incapacitated, which is precisely what Wright would later allege Jeffrey had confessed to doing. James Tappy Wright says the confession happened in early 1973 at Jeffrey's apartment in London. The two men were reminiscing about Hendrix, planning a tour of the United States built around a concert film that Jeffrey owned. As the evening wore on and the alcohol flowed, Jeffrey became agitated. He grew pale. His grip on his glass tightened. Then, according to Wright, he began to talk. Wright has described the moment in interviews as something he did not invite and did not want. Jeffrey told him that he had been in London on the night of Hendrix's death, not out of town, as he had claimed at the time. He said that he and a small group had gone to Danman's hotel room. They found Hendrix already unconscious from the sleeping medication, and instead of calling for help, they forced pills into his mouth and poured bottles of red wine down his throat. Jeffrey's alleged explanation was direct and without remorse. He said that Jimmy was worth far more to him dead than alive. He said that Jimmy had been about to leave him, and that if he lost Jimmy, he would lose everything. He said he had no choice. Wright claims he said nothing publicly for decades because he was afraid. Jeffrey was not a man who responded well to people who crossed him. He had ties to figures in British organized crime. His reputation for intimidation was well documented. Wright knew what Jeffrey was capable of, and he did not feel safe speaking until Jeffrey was dead and enough time had passed that the immediate danger had faded. Jeffrey died on March 5, 1973, aboard an Iberia Airlines DC-9 that collided with another aircraft in mid-air over Nantes, France. He was 39 years old, 8 days short of his 40th birthday. The crash killed 68 people. It was ruled an accident, though conspiracy theorists have noted the timing without producing evidence of anything more sinister. With Jeffrey gone, Wright carried the confession alone for 36 years before putting it into print. Not everyone accepts Wright's account. Bob Levine, who was Hendrix's American manager at the time of his death, called the claims a fabrication and suggested that Wright's motives were commercial, that he had constructed a scandal to sell books. Critics of the memoir have pointed out that Wright was not a close confidant of Jeffrey's, that the confession as described was recklessly incriminating for a man known for cold calculation, and that 36 years is an extraordinarily long time to hold a secret of that magnitude before going public. These are fair objections. Testimony from a single source, delivered decades after the fact, about a dead man who cannot deny it, is not proof of anything. Courts require more than memoirs. History requires more than allegations. But history also requires honesty about what remains unexplained. The ambulance delay has never been satisfactorily accounted for. Danman's version of events changed in significant ways across multiple interviews given over multiple decades. Dr. Bannister's medical account is inconsistent with the official cause of death in a way that has never been resolved. The financial relationship between Jeffrey and Hendrix was, by any objective reading, exploitative to a degree that bordered on criminal. The insurance policy allegation, if accurate, adds a motive that is both clear and financially enormous. And Jeffrey himself is on record, through Wright, as having admitted it. Monica Danman, the one person who was definitely in the flat that night, never gave a fully consistent account. In 1995, she published her own version of events, which resulted in a lawsuit from Kathy Etchingham, a former girlfriend of Hendrix's, who challenged Danman's claims. Danman was found in contempt of court. 2 days after that ruling, she was found dead in her car from carbon monoxide poisoning. The manner of her death was ruled suicide. The witnesses are gone. The manager is gone. The girlfriend is gone. And the greatest guitarist who ever lived has been dead for more than 50 years. What remains are the songs. They remain because music does not die the way people do. The Wind Cries Mary is still playing somewhere right now. All Along the Watchtower is still being heard for the first time by a teenager who does not yet know what to call the feeling it produces. That music was made by a man who grew up invisible, who taught himself to play on a broomstick, who climbed from poverty and neglect to the very top of the world, and who, at the moment he was finally ready to take control of his own life and his own career, may have been silenced by the one man who was supposed to protect him. Whether Michael Jeffrey confessed, whether he gave the order, whether he was in that hotel room on the night of September 18, 1970, none of that is proven beyond the doubt that courts require.